I found the diary while I was packing up the attic for her, not against her. That's the part nobody believes when I tell this story now. I wasn't looking for anything. Vanessa and my son were finally moving into the house they'd been saving for 11 years to buy, and I'd offered, the way mothers do, to help sort through the boxes still sitting in my attic from when they'd lived with us during their first rough year of marriage. I found her old journal wedged behind a box of Connor's college textbooks, the leather cover soft with age, and I almost set it aside without opening it at all. I don't know, even now, what made me lift the cover instead. Maybe some old, useless instinct that had kept me alive through 30 years of reading contracts for a living, the part of me trained to notice when something has been placed just a little too carefully out of sight. I read the first page standing in the dust of that attic, my knees aching on the cold floor, and by the third page, my hands had gone completely still. 10 years of Sunday dinners, 10 years of birthday cards signed with love, always. 10 years of a smile I had believed, without ever once questioning it, was real. I didn't cry. I didn't call Connor. I just closed the journal, slid it back exactly where I'd found it, and went downstairs to finish making the tea I'd promised her, because the truth was sitting so heavy and so quiet in my chest that it didn't need to announce itself yet. My name is Margaret Doyle, though everyone who's ever mattered to me calls me Maggie. I'm 61 years old, and for 28 years I worked as a probate and estate paralegal, the kind of job that teaches you, faster than almost anything else, exactly how families really behave once money and grief are in the same room together. I spent my career reading the documents people leave behind when they think no one else will ever see them. The handwritten codicil scrawled in a moment of spite, the beneficiary quietly removed a month before someone died, the sibling who suddenly discovers religion right around the time an inheritance is being divided. I learned to trust paper trails over performances, because paper doesn't know how to smile at you while it lies. I believed, for most of my adult life, that I could read a family the way I read a file, quietly, patiently, without ever needing to raise my voice to find what was really there. That belief had never once failed me, until the day I stood in my own attic and realized I had spent an entire decade completely unable to read the woman sitting closest to my son. Connor met Vanessa the year he turned 26, at a mutual friend's wedding, where she'd worn blue and laughed at something he'd said from across the room, loud enough that he crossed the whole reception just to find out what it was. She was warm in a way that felt effortless, the kind of warm I'd always been slightly suspicious of after decades of watching people perform warmth in front of a judge and something colder in front of a mirror. But I told myself that suspicion was simply an old woman's habit, a professional hazard, not a real instinct worth trusting. I welcomed her the way I would have wanted to be welcomed, invited her to every holiday, taught her my late mother's recipes, sat with her the year she lost her own father, and had no one else nearby who understood what that particular grief felt like. I gave up things too, in those years, the way mothers-in-law rarely admit to. I stepped back from decisions in my own son's life I might once have had a voice in, softened opinions I would have once stated plainly, all so that Vanessa would never feel like an outsider in a family that had, by every appearance, folded her in completely. My younger sister Denise was the one who made those years feel less lonely, or so I believed for a very long time. Denise came to every family dinner, always sat close to Vanessa, always seemed to know just the right thing to say, to smooth over any small tension before it could grow. I confided in Denise about everything, my worries about Connor's long work hours, my quiet hope for grandchildren, even small doubts about Vanessa I never once voiced anywhere else. Looking back now, I understand that admiration and envy wear the same face, and that the person closest enough to comfort you is sometimes also close enough to repeat everything you've said to someone who was never supposed to hear it. I went back to that attic 3 days later, once I'd stopped shaking every time I thought about what I'd read, and I brought a small notebook of my own this time, because 28 years in probate had taught me exactly one unbreakable rule: gather everything before they know you've seen it. I didn't confront Vanessa. I didn't call Connor in a panic. Instead, I made a quiet appointment with an old colleague, David Okafor, who still practiced family and elder law 2 towns over, and I asked him, carefully, hypothetically, what someone would need to prove if they suspected a family trust was being quietly restructured without every beneficiary's full understanding. I hadn't yet told him what I'd read in that journal. I simply wanted to know, before I let myself feel anything else, exactly how much danger the people I loved might actually be standing in. David and I met at a diner, halfway between our 2 towns, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that's been sitting too long, because I didn't want this conversation happening anywhere either of us was known. I told him finally what I'd read, and I watched him go quiet, in the particular way lawyers go quiet when they're already 3 steps ahead of you, already cataloguing which documents would matter and which wouldn't. He asked me not to say anything to Connor yet, not because he doubted me, but because he'd seen enough half-finished family disputes blow up before the paperwork existed to prove anything, and he didn't want me walking into that fight unarmed. I agreed, though every instinct I had wanted to call my son that same night. Instead, I went home, made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink, and started reading the diary again from the beginning, this time with the notebook open beside me, this time reading it the way I'd once read a will I suspected had been altered, not for the story, but for the dates. What the diary described, in Vanessa's own careful handwriting, wasn't an affair or a simple lie. It was something slower, and in its way, more unsettling. Entry after entry detailed a plan she'd been quietly executing for nearly 6 years, gradually convincing Connor, through 100 small, reasonable-sounding conversations, to shift portions of the modest family trust my late husband had set up for our future grandchildren into accounts structured under Vanessa's side of the family instead. Always framed as smarter estate planning, always presented with paperwork that looked, on its surface, entirely legitimate. I spent the next several weeks doing what I'd spent my whole career doing, quietly and without drama, pulling trust amendments, comparing signature dates against the notary logs, tracing where exactly the redirected funds had actually gone. What I found didn't just confirm the diary, it went further. There was a secondary account, opened 4 years earlier, funded by transfers that were small enough individually to avoid notice, but added up, over time, to a sum that made my hands go cold reading it on the page. People who think they'll never get caught leave the messiest trails, and Vanessa, confident that no one in this family read paperwork as carefully as she assumed only lawyers did, had left initials, dates, and a signature pattern so consistent it was almost proud of itself. I spent 3 full weekends at David's office, going through everything, boxes of old trust paperwork pulled from storage, bank statements David had helped me request through channels that didn't require tipping anyone off too early. I built a timeline the way I used to build them for contested estates. Every transfer date, every amendment, every notary stamp, laid out in order until the shape of the thing became impossible to misread. Some of the transfers were small enough that, alone, they'd have looked like nothing at all. $100 here, $300 there, the kind of movement that wouldn't raise a single question on its own. It was only in aggregate, only laid end to end across 6 years, that the pattern stopped looking like carelessness and started looking like architecture. But the deeper I went, the less the story felt like simple greed, and the more it felt like something with roots older than I could explain. The dollar amounts didn't map neatly onto anything Vanessa and Connor needed or had ever discussed wanting. They mapped, instead, almost exactly onto a business debt from 30 years earlier, one I hadn't thought about in decades, one that had nearly destroyed my late husband's small construction company back when Connor was still a boy. I hadn't made that connection until David, running the old business partnership filings at my request, found the name of the original partner my husband had bought out under contentious terms in 1994, a man named Walter Cray, Vanessa's father. The confirmation came, in the end, not from Vanessa, but from her own mother, Ruth, who called me 2 weeks later, sounding like a woman finally setting down something impossibly heavy. Ruth told me that Walter had spent the last years of his life quietly convinced my husband had cheated him out of his fair share of that old partnership, that he died still believing it, still bitter, and that Vanessa, barely out of college when her father passed, grieving and looking for somewhere to put an anger she didn't fully understand herself, had promised him, at his bedside, that their family would one day get back what she believed had been taken from them. Ruth said she hadn't known, not really, how far Vanessa had actually carried that promise until the diary surfaced, and that she'd spent years assuming it was grief talking, not an actual plan being built, one careful transfer at a time. David pulled the original 1994 buyout agreement from archived county records to settle the older question once and for all, and the documents told a far less dramatic story than either family had spent 30 years believing. My husband had, in fact, overpaid Walter for his share, not underpaid him, a fact Walter had apparently never told his own wife or daughter, whether from pride or from a version of the story he preferred to remember instead. Ruth sent me a photograph, a few days later, of a letter she'd found in Walter's own desk after his funeral. One she said she'd never had the courage to fully read at the time. A short, unfinished note to my husband, dated only months before Walter's death, that began with an apology he'd apparently never worked up the nerve to send. I sat with that photograph a long time. It's a strange kind of grief, mourning a peace that two stubborn men could have made decades earlier and simply never did, leaving the unfinished business of it to land, uninvited, on their children instead. I didn't get to sit with that discovery for long, because the moment that finally broke everything into the open happened without me anywhere near it. It happened at Connor's 41st birthday dinner, at a restaurant I hadn't even been invited to that year, and I heard about it secondhand the next morning from my sister Denise, who called sounding shaken in a way I hadn't heard from her in years. Denise described the table in pieces, the appetizers barely touched, Vanessa's cousin making an offhand joke about finally getting what the Crays were always owed, a joke clearly meant to stay inside a small circle that hadn't accounted for Connor sitting right there. Denise said Connor went very still, the way I imagine I must have gone still in that attic, and asked, quietly, what exactly the cousin meant. She said the silence that followed lasted long enough that the waiter came and went twice before anyone at that table said another word, and that Vanessa's face, for the first time in 10 years, showed something that wasn't a smile at all. Denise called me again the next morning, before Connor did, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years, and told me there was something else she needed to say. She admitted, haltingly, that Vanessa had confided in her early on, years ago, about wanting to make things right for her father, and that Denise had known, in some vague, uncomfortable way she'd never let herself examine closely, that it involved money and old resentment, without ever asking enough questions to understand exactly what it meant. She said she'd told herself it wasn't her business, that families sort these things out on their own, and that she was sorry, genuinely sorry, for the years she'd spent sitting across from me at holiday dinners, saying nothing at all. I told her I appreciated her finally saying it, and I meant that, but I also understood, hanging up the phone, that trust doesn't fully rebuild itself just because someone finally tells you the truth after the damage is already done. There's a particular quiet loneliness in realizing the person you called every week for a decade was carrying a piece of the answer the entire time and chose comfort over honesty instead. We're still close, my sister and I. It's simply a different kind of close now, one with a little more distance built into it on purpose. Connor came to my house that same night, still in the shirt he'd worn to his own birthday dinner, and sat at my kitchen table the way he used to as a teenager when something at school had gone badly wrong. I told him everything then, the diary, David, the trust, his grandfather's real buyout terms, because he deserved the whole file, not a softened version of it. He didn't ask me why I hadn't told him sooner. He asked, instead, quietly, whether I thought Vanessa had ever actually loved him at all, underneath whatever else had been happening for 6 years. I told him I honestly didn't know, and that it was possible for both things to be true at once, that a person could love you completely and still be capable of quietly working against the people who loved you first. It wasn't the comfort he wanted, but it was the truest thing I had. Vanessa came to see me alone, a week later, uninvited, and stood in my kitchen the way she had 100 times before, except this time neither of us reached for the tea kettle. She tried to explain it the way people always try to explain the things they've spent years planning, that it had started small, that she'd told herself it wasn't really taking anything, just correcting an old wrong, that somewhere along the way the plan had simply kept going, because stopping it would have meant admitting what it actually was. She asked if there was any way I could understand. Any way this didn't have to mean losing the family she'd built with Connor over 10 real years, diary or not. I told her the line I'd been quietly assembling for weeks, without realizing it, until that exact moment. I do understand it, Vanessa. I understand grief that curdles into something you can't put down, better than you might think. But understanding why you did it was never going to be the same thing as pretending I could still trust you with my son's future, or his children's. She didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't one that would have changed the documents sitting in David's office. I kept the diary itself, in the end, tucked into a drawer in my own desk, rather than handed over as evidence for anything, because it had never really been a legal document. It was a woman's private record of the slow erosion of her own conscience, and some things are better kept as a private lesson than turned into a weapon. I read it exactly one more time, cover to cover, alone, the week the settlement was finalized, not looking for anything new this time, just trying to understand the version of Vanessa who'd written those first entries. Hopeful, grieving, 23 years old, and certain she was righting a wrong instead of building one. I don't think that young woman fully understood, back then, how far 6 quiet years would eventually carry her. What followed wasn't a war, and I made sure of that deliberately. I didn't drag Vanessa's father's old grievance through a courtroom, and I didn't let David turn the diverted trust funds into a public spectacle either. We handled the recovery quietly, through amendment and restitution, the same careful paperwork that had built the problem in the first place, now used to undo it. Connor and Vanessa separated by the following winter, and I stayed entirely out of that decision, because it was never mine to make for him. What I did make sure of was that the trust for my future grandchildren was rebuilt clean, with oversight this time, protected in a way it never should have needed to be protected from family in the first place. When Vanessa asked, once, near the very end of the settlement, whether there was any version of things where she could still come to holidays, still be Grandma Maggie's family the way she'd been for a decade, I told her no, gently, the way you close a file you already know the ending of, complete and settled, and not worth reopening. Connor took almost a year before he could talk about any of it without his voice changing, and I didn't push him. I made sure he knew, without ever saying it too many times, that none of it had been his failure to see, that a decade of genuine warmth, built alongside one quiet resentment, isn't something a loving husband is supposed to be able to spot, any more than I'd been able to spot it myself as her mother-in-law of 10 years. He's dating again now, carefully, the way people do once they've learned exactly how much a smile can hide, and still be partly true. I don't offer opinions on it unless he asks. I've learned, the hard way, that the most useful thing I can do for my son now isn't watching for the next betrayal on his behalf. It's simply staying someone he can bring a suspicion to early, before it has 10 years to calcify into something neither of us can undo. A year later, I started something I'd never expected to build at 62, a small free clinic, 2 Saturdays a month at the community center, where I sit with families untangling exactly the kind of quiet, slow-moving betrayal that took me a decade to see in my own house. Most of what I do still looks like paperwork and patient listening, the same skills that built my whole career, just aimed now at people who don't have the money for a lawyer and desperately need someone who knows how to read what a family won't say out loud. I think about that diary sometimes, and about how easily 10 years of real warmth and one careful, buried resentment managed to live inside the exact same smile without either of us ever noticing the seam between them. I still keep the leather journal in that same desk drawer, and every so often, when a new family sits down across from me at the clinic, insisting nothing is wrong, I think of it again, not as a warning against people like Vanessa, but as a reminder that grief left unspoken for long enough will always find some quiet way to spend itself, whether we're watching for it or not. Sometimes, the greatest protection you can give the people you love isn't watching for the dramatic betrayal. It's learning to read the quiet ones before they've had 10 years to write themselves into your family's own handwriting. If you'd found that diary in the attic, Would you have told your son that same day, or waited the way I did, and gathered everything first, before anyone knew you'd seen it at all? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you want more stories like mine, make sure you're subscribed, because there's another one coming next week.